Carly, for having me. I always really like talking to your group. I have to apologize for my voice today. I'm getting over a little cold. It wasn't COVID, thank goodness. So today I wanted to talk to you about resubmissions because I think Carly had some requests to talk about this particular topic. So let me share my slides with you. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I wanted to reiterate Carly's sentiment that yes, please just chime in if you have any questions. Unfortunately, we can't be in person and it's hard to have an interactive discussion over Zoom, but let's do our best because I really would like to get all your questions answered and have this be more of an informal conversation and really help you get as much information as you need. So I have been reviewing grants, including resubmissions, for lots of years, and I have formed some pretty strong opinions sometimes on what does and does not work in resubmitting your grant. So to give you a quick overview of what we'll talk about today, first, I want to talk about the decision as to whether to resubmit at all when you get your summary statement back, because some of the times the answer is no, you shouldn't resubmit this grant. You should go back in with a new grant proposal. So we'll talk about how to make that decision. And then I want to give you some of the thoughts on how to organize the introduction. The introduction is that one-page response to reviewers that you submit. And I should say that everything I say today is kind of geared towards the NIH, but really should apply to resubmitting a grant for any funding agency. And then I'll give you some thoughts on how to be responsive with your language in your resubmission. And then finally, we'll go through some examples that I've picked up along the way. I think the theme that I really want to hammer home today is that a grant application resubmission is not a rebuttal like you would do for a manuscript resubmission. It's a very different animal. Your goal really is to deliver to the reviewers exactly what they're asking for. And it's a fairly rare occasion that you can really rebut or disagree too much with the reviewers. So it's very different than resubmitting a manuscript. But first, I want to show you this cartoon of what peer review feels like. So it's always reviewer 3. Not always, but sometimes, you think you're good, and then reviewer 3 is often the one who may be most outside of your field. And so they're the ones that come back in with the why are you doing this kind of questions and really kind of hammer that home and drive you crazy. So when you get your summary statement, hopefully you'll have a result like this and you won't probably have to resubmit, but usually you won't. And you will have to decide whether to resubmit. So when you get your summary statement, my advice to you is to read it really closely, line by line. Do this on separate occasions. So really take some time to digest and just kind of sit on what the reviewers are telling you. Take some time to listen to them and process before you really decide what to do. As to whether you should resubmit based on your summary statement, decide on the best option after you've done this and really had some time to let it sink in. So you have 3 options. So you can resubmit as an A1. So in NIH language, the A1 is the resubmission. So that's what probably you are hoping you'll be able to do. The second option would be to submit it again as a new proposal. That would be an A0. So don't go back in with a resubmission, but send it in as a new grant. And then a third option would be to switch to a new study section or a new mechanism or even a new agency altogether, depending on what your review comments look like. So when would you decide to go ahead and resubmit as an A1? So if you have a score that's quite good and relatively near the funding line, this might be a good option for you. If the concerns that the reviewers brought up are relatively minor and you think they're pretty addressable, or even if your score wasn't necessarily close to the funding line, but if you had very specific concerns that you think are addressable, this might be a situation in which you could go ahead and resubmit. If the reviewers sound enthusiastic, if they didn't identify anything that would be considered a fatal flaw that you just can't address and that they just won't accept, and if the strengths that they identified throughout your summary statement really kind of outweigh the weaknesses, then you're probably in pretty good shape to go ahead and resubmit. However, my advice to you is that if you got a score that's well outside the funding line, and if they had major criticisms that will be really hard for you to address, think about submitting the grant as a new grant, rewriting the whole thing, revising it, of course, according to their comments, but then when you go back in, submitting as a new grant. And the reason I say this is because it may be a faster route to funding, because if the reviews are overly negative, especially for a triaged grant, and when the reviewer comments really just kind of reflect a lack of enthusiasm for your proposal, you might be better off going back in with a new application, and then hopefully getting a better review next time, and then being able to fix those minor concerns on the resubmission. And this would ultimately be a faster route to funding. And especially if you're triaged. I rarely see triaged grants get funded if they're resubmitted. And then finally, if you have a grant that's triaged or very low scoring, and the reviewer comments really just indicate that they don't appreciate the problem you're trying to study, maybe you're in the wrong study section, or maybe you're even in the wrong mechanism, or even the wrong agency. So this is something you should also sit back and think about before you just go forward with a resubmission. And to further hopefully convince you that it's not a great idea to resubmit a triaged grant, I want to show you this data from NIH. So this chart, the first two bars here show what happens when the first application, your first submission, is discussed. So you get a score. So the tall red bar here shows what happens if this application is resubmitted. It's usually discussed, whereas the blue bar shows the number of applications in their study that were not discussed. So in other words, you're pretty likely to get discussed again if your first application was discussed in the first place. However, the second set of bars shows what happens when you resubmit a triaged grant. So only about half the time will you even get discussed on your resubmission, and even much less of the time will you get funded. They didn't show the data on who gets funded, but I can tell you just anecdotally from my experience, I've only known about 2 triage grants that got funded on the resubmission ever. It's pretty unusual to get the triage grant funded. So my advice to you while you're thinking about all these things is to involve your program officer for sure. So this person may attend your study section meeting, often will attend your study section meeting and listen to the discussion, so they will know exactly what was said. And they can really advise you on the sentiment of the reviewers and how to kind of read between the lines of your summary statement. And hopefully they'll be able to advise you on what the biggest issues were, and give you some thoughts on how to win over the reviewers. So in terms of timing of your resubmission, my advice to you, if you can, is to resubmit as soon as possible, because you'll have the best chance of getting the same reviewers, which usually is an advantage on the resubmission. The exception for this, definitely, if you need more additional preliminary data, especially if they've asked for that, do not resubmit. Do not spend your time resubmitting if you don't have that yet. Just hold off until you have all the data that you need, because they will call you on that. Especially if there's something specific that they asked for in their original comments, you need to wait until you have that you can give to them before you resubmit. And while your original submission is under review, you should assume that it won't get funded the first time and that you will have to resubmit and revise and resubmit. And so you should be anticipating this and working on getting additional preliminary data at that time. Does anybody have any questions? I should mention too that I'm happy to share my slides after this talk. So when you get your summary statement, I advise you to go through and point by point, line by line, actually highlight each weakness that the reviewers have noted. And this goes for both the summary of discussion, which is that big paragraph that they have at the very beginning of your summary statement, and also for the individual reviews, so the point by point reviews that reviewers 1, 2, and 3 give you. So the summary of discussion, that paragraph up front, that is written by the SRO who has been at the meeting, and it captures what was discussed during the study section. So you can read this paragraph to kind of gauge what matters most to the reviewers and to the study section as a whole. So any weakness that's raised in this paragraph, be sure to hit it really hard in your resubmission, but also address all the concerns that are listed throughout. So the most important critiques are the concerns that are listed in that summary of discussion up front, but also any concern that was raised by multiple reviewers, especially, those are really important to address. So if you do this and go through line by line, highlighting your summary statement, it can provide you a roadmap really to start writing your response in that one-page introduction. And it also helps you avoid missing any individual points that need to be addressed in resubmission, especially because you might be a little annoyed about some of these points and kind of psychologically just prone to dismiss them or ignore them. But I think actually going through line by line helps you hopefully not do this. And I should say a word, it can be really irritating to get your summary statement back, because you'll get comments that you just completely disagree with and you think are frankly quite ignorant. So in that situation, I tell people to just go put it away for the weekend and forget about it and then come back to it. Give yourself a break, because it can be hard getting these critiques for your grants back. And it's like that for everyone. So you're not alone. So here's an example of that summary of discussion that I was talking about. So that paragraph that they write up front. And I wanted to show you a few features of this, typical features of this. So typically they'll spend a few lines summarizing what your grant's about. And then usually there'll be a couple of positive comments. So in this case, I hope everyone can read this. The research was thought to be highly significant because of the importance of overcoming the immune response, et cetera. The innovative concepts, blah, 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 were viewed positively. The thorough experimental plan was a positive. The outstanding investigative team was a positive. So that's great. However, in the next few lines, here's where they tear you up. So questions were raised about the suitability of mouse models for identifying immune responses that will be relevant to humans. Okay, that's not good. Reviewers disagreed about the necessity for testing multiple capsid mutations. So, excuse me. So in this case, they've raised two concerns that were major enough to have made it into the discussion. So these two concerns are, regardless of what comes next, these two concerns are two that you really have to hit on the resubmission to respond to. So one possible approach, and my advice would actually be to, in the one-page introduction, when you write it, you can lead off with these 2 points. So the response, your first response in your one-page introduction would be to better justify the mouse models, because the reviewers had raised questions about this, and then relate them to human health. Or perhaps if there is a different mouse model that you can use that may be considered more related to human health, you could consider switching to that mouse model. And then response 2 would then be perhaps to reduce the number of capsid mutants tested. And this again would obviously depend on what the point-by-point criticisms entail, but the take home here is to just orient your one-page introduction to really focus on these main points that were, or main criticisms that were featured. So here's another example where they actually found 5 things to complain about up front. So one is, so weaknesses that reduce enthusiasm, and they have a laundry list of 5 things. So skepticism among some reviewers about the significance of targeting SEVI, whatever that is, doesn't matter. because there's limited literature. Sorry, my phone's ringing. Inhibition of SEVI may reduce HIV infection, etc. So this person really got a laundry list in their introduction. So my advice to them would also be start your one pager with these 5 points and address them. But of course, you also need to address all the other concerns that were in the individual reviews. Okay. Anybody have any questions? All right, I want to go through some common critiques that really come up frequently in the summary statements that come across my desk. So 3 of the really big ones are incremental. So if you get this criticism, this means that the reviewers just really weren't convinced that you were doing significant, that your proposal was significant in terms of moving the field forward. They thought that whatever you were proposing just wasn't quite big enough to be the next step necessary in this line of research. So that's what that means if you get that. Unfocused is another really big one. This typically means that they felt that your aims were kind of meandering, say, instead of telling a story, telling a unified story. And all of these are pretty addressable, I think. Overambitious is another really common one. I find junior faculty get this criticism a lot because reviewers think maybe they have proposed too much. They don't quite know what's possible in the 4 to 5 year term of a R01, for example. So be cognizant when you're writing your proposal that you're not proposing too much for the time that you would have if you were given this grant. More preliminary data is a really, really common thing that reviewers will come back with. And this just means they think it's a bit premature and they want to see more evidence that you're ready to do what you propose. So go back to the drawing board and just go back into your lab or into your clinic and get some more data before you go back in. And then finally, and this is one that I really want to advise you to try to address up front before you get this comment. So investigator lacks specific expertise for a certain part of the proposal. So the solution to this is to add a collaborator, whether it's a co-PI or a co-investigator. That's something you can think about, but I think it really does not hurt you to add a collaborator if you need a collaborator. Even if you don't think you need a collaborator, but the reviewers do think you need a collaborator, you should add a collaborator. It's nothing, it doesn't take anything away from you. And in fact, it helps you, I think, long-term. It can be really annoying to get this comment back like, oh, they don't know how to do this, so they need someone else. And you say, oh, well, yes, I do know how to do it. But it's a situation where it's just in your best interest to reach out and get someone who's a known expert in whatever it is that they think that you're lacking expertise on. Okay. So with all this in mind, I can tell you that in my view, from what I've seen, the major or most common reason for a failed resubmission, one that doesn't get funded that second time, is just an overall failure on the investigator's part to significantly revise the proposal to really fully address all these reviewers' concerns. So you need to show that you've heard them. If you don't impress them with a big picture, like, yeah, I really heard you, here's what I did to fix the grant or to fix the problems that you saw in the grant, no amount of revision is going to sell them if you don't do this. They have to be excited about the big picture question in your grant. So you need to figure out how to elevate your idea and really sell that on the resubmission. Any questions? Comments? Has anybody had any of these experiences already in their summary statements?
I have a question.
Yes.
I got a grant that I think is worthy of resubmission, a review. And one of the things was that contingent aims, because we were going to do some community engagement kind of stuff as preparatory work. So we've basically done a scaled back version of that in the 8 months between, well, now almost a year between when we submitted it before. And I think we've addressed their concerns, but obviously not in the way that we initially proposed, because we didn't have funding to do the work that we initially were going to do. So how do you not minimize what you've done, but also, I can't claim that we did the whole thing that we proposed in AIM 1, which now has just gone away. So just kind of wondering about that, like, maybe that's too granular a question, but like.
Well, no, I don't think at all. So I think so you got some feedback from the first submission and they wanted you to do something else. And now you've done something slightly different, but it basically takes away the need to do AIM 1.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you should really highlight that and say, hey, look, here's all the great progress we've made. And in fact, that makes, maybe I'd have to see the exact situation, but maybe AIM 1 is now an evolution of what you had before. It can be a different and more sophisticated or more advanced AIM. And so I think that's great. And maybe you, depending on what your other criticisms were, maybe you open up your one-page introduction saying, hey, look, we have all this great new preliminary data. We've done community engagement, which shows this and that, and it shows that we're set up to do this proposal even better now. So even if it's not exactly what they asked you to do.
Yeah, no, I that makes a lot of sense. It's just, it's not as much as we proposed doing, but they basically said, we're afraid that you won't, that thing, like if you don't get AIM 1 done, what's going to happen to the rest of the proposal, which I totally get. I don't know that I agreed with it for this particular situation, but so I think I feel like we have answered that critique, but it wasn't as robust as I would have loved to have done it, is basically what I feel. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, but still, it sounds like it was good progress. And if you think that if you think it sets the stage up to make the rest of the grant seem less risky to them, because it sounds like they thought AIM 1 was going to fail the proposal. Is that right? Yeah. So if you feel like this new work that you've done eliminates that concern, then I think you can make that argument.
Okay.
And revise your aims accordingly. Yeah. So I think that's actually a pretty good situation to be in. And it's really common for reviewers to come back and say, okay, it's a little premature because we don't have this, and we're worried that the rest of the grant's gonna fall down. So
right. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so anybody? Oh, sorry, Sarah. Yes.
No worries. I actually have a question, and I'm maybe I should talk with you about this offline, but I was just curious. So I have a submission, and I'm thinking about the whole kind of notion of changing mechanism. So one of the big criticisms was they felt like it was submitted to the wrong mechanism. And so if I'm going to take this, it would be a new submission and take it to a different mechanism, short of changing, making the changes that were recommended by the prior submission. How much of a kind of an overhaul do you really need to have on if you make a shift between mechanism? I mean, obviously pulling out the language that says I'm submitting to this versus that, but do you feel like there needs to be a significant overhaul to switch mechanisms, or do you feel like if you're getting the advice that it's the wrong mechanism, you can just kind of take it elsewhere?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. I think it kind of depends on which mechanism you're switching from and to. So for example, like if it was an R01 and they said, oh, this isn't quite ready for an R01, you should submit an R21. If it's that kind of thing, then you need to scale back the scope of your proposal a whole lot. But you don't necessarily need to change the goals, the overall research goals. Like you don't need to change what you're asking or what you're trying to study, but just make sure that the scope of the grant is aligned with the mechanism. So can I ask what mechanism it is and was, or
So I'm moving away from the cats because they thought that it wasn't enough of a new direction for me. So that was the overlying biggest criticism, was they just didn't think that it was enough of a diversion from my prior work. And so it would just go into a regular R01.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, in that case, just whatever study section you think is going to go to, tailor the language towards that study section, of course. But no, I don't think I'd have to see it, but I don't think you necessarily need to overhaul everything if it's just a matter, if it's the same kind of size grant. I don't think it needs a major overhaul in terms of scope and the amount of work that you propose.
Great, thanks.
So, sure. But definitely, I'll take this opportunity to say a word about study sections. Sometimes your research could fit with a variety of study sections, and you kind of want to tailor your language towards the study section you're trying to get it into when you're writing, especially when you're writing your title, your abstract, and your aims page. Pay attention really to the keywords you use there and try to target it towards the study section you're looking for. Okay. So a few words, you may already know this, but about the review process. So these are a couple just subtle points to appreciate. So in a resubmission, the reviewers will also be able to see the prior summary statement, that is the criticism they just gave you, which you're responding to. They'll have access to that, so they can review that while they're reading your resubmission. However, they won't have access to the prior submission, meaning the prior grant, the prior proposal that you put in. So they won't be able to read your old research plan, just your new one. When you resubmit, they're going to be obviously evaluating your responses to the first set of critiques, but not only that. It's open. They can come back and criticize whatever they want. They can come back and pick on an entirely new issue. So if there's an issue in your grant that you kind of think you should fix, even if the reviewers didn't note it the first time, go ahead and fix it, because it's totally up to them. They can hammer on whatever they want to that second time. Also, depending on how frequently the study section turns over the members of the study section, you may not get the same set of reviewers. You may get all three reviewers the same, but often you'll get at least one reviewer that is new. Finally, when the reviewers are given instructions on reviewing your grant, they're specifically asked to address whether your resubmission is responsive or not. And so obviously they really like it when you're responsive to their first set of reviews, even when you get a different reviewer for that second time. So when you're writing this introduction, this all important one page, which I think is almost as important as your specific aims page. So it's a page you need to spend a lot of time on. My preferred way of doing this, and a good structure I think most people follow, is to have an opening paragraph where you just take a sentence or two and thank the reviewers. You can briefly summarize the strengths. You don't need to spend a lot of space going into the strengths because they know what they liked and they remember, and that's kind of a waste of space. But you can just have a sentence or a half sentence summarizing the strengths that they noted. And then I recommend that you also summarize the major weaknesses that they identified in your grant and take that opportunity to address what you have changed in the response. And I'll give you an example in a couple minutes. So then after this opening paragraph, go into a point-by-point response to the summary statement where you briefly paraphrase each concern and then followed by your response. And a nice way to do this is in a bullet list form. Sometimes, or often, or usually I should say, probably, you'll get a laundry list basically of things that you need to respond to. And you can't possibly fit this all in one page. So it's really good if you can, in your introduction, if you can paraphrase things and also just combine any related critiques into a single response, just to kind of, get more in there, but don't cram too much together. You don't want to give the reviewers a headache to review it. So it can be a fine line there. When you're writing your introduction, be sure to reference the sections in your proposal that you've revised, and especially point out any new data, like say, oh, look, see new figure 6 because we've added this data, for example. And if you say we've responded to this and that, you can say, see paragraph 2 in significance or something like that. And again, I'll show you examples of this, but make sure you tell them where to look. Don't let them read this page and not know where to find these changes in your proposal. So let me give you an example of that, how I would write the paragraph in the first paragraph in your introduction. So recall this example we went through a few minutes ago where they were criticized for the suitability of their mouse models, and maybe they also had too many mutants that they were testing. So in this case, here is how I would structure the one paragraph up front. So we thank the reviewers for their thoughtful critique, which we've used to significantly revise and strengthen our proposal. And you can say something like, strengths were noted in significance and innovation of our plan to investigate how to overcome the immune response to AAV therapy, as well as our outstanding team. And then go into the weaknesses. So we've also addressed the noted weaknesses, including better justification of our mouse models and reducing the number of capsid mutants tested, which has resulted in a significantly stronger research plan. So take that sentence to show the major things that you've done to address their concerns and conclude that, hey, this has really strengthened our proposal. And then additional concerns are also addressed as outlined below and in the revised proposal. Changes are marked using vertical lines in the left margin. This is always how I recommend marking changes. However, I want to note that NIH has very recently added some language in their review revision instructions, and they're now saying not to mark the changes. I don't know if anybody's heard about this. It hasn't been publicized very well, but that language is there. I do know that some people are still marking their changes, and I have not heard of this causing any problems, but I just wanted to put that on your radar, that this is now in the NIH language that kind of snuck it in there, that you're not supposed to be marking your changes in the proposal anymore. So I think that's kind of unfortunate, actually, but yeah, Sarah.
Yeah, no, I would actually bring attention to that because I read that fine print and I didn't, and I was criticized for not. So it's a little murky. I don't know if anyone else has had similar experiences, but it's really unfortunate that it's not more of kind of a widespread change, because it does kind of rear its ugly head.
Okay, that's good to hear, actually, because I had not yet heard of anyone being criticized for that. So I don't know why they didn't make a bigger issue of it, because it's a big change in my opinion, but nobody knows about it. So maybe I should be, maybe I should announce this more broadly. But yeah, thank you for that. And I think it's unfortunate that they made that change, because I thought marking the changes was a really useful feature, but that's NIH. They do what they want. So, okay, yeah, so this sentence that I've underlined in green, where you address the weaknesses, I think is the most important point in this opening paragraph. And so now we'll scratch this last sentence officially. And then you could, when you start the point by point, you could open with suitability of mouse models relevant to human immune response and say, we've now better justified our mouse models, and then in parentheses, see significant. So that tells them where to go for this new information. And we've explained how our results will be translatable to human health. And then briefly, and then you can explain that just in a few lines, or depending on how many other criticisms you have to address, maybe you don't even explain that there much. Maybe you just refer them to your significance section. And then point 2 would be the concern here in bold, the number of capsid mutants tested is too large, you can say, we agree. That's really responsive language. We agree. And we've reduced the number of capsid mutants that will be tested from 5 to 2, for example, and C aim 3A for justification. So you show them exactly where to look. Okay. And then for whatever additional points also came in your summary statement, use bullet points. And you can also list which reviewers had these concerns. So some people will do like this, they'll say number of capsid mutants tested is too large, parentheses, R1 and R3, if those were the two reviewers that called that out. Okay. So in terms of organizing the one-page introduction, there are a couple of ways you can do it. First, and this is what I've kind of just shown you, you can organize it by major versus minor criticisms. And this is really kind of the way that I prefer most of the time. So in this case, you would focus on the weaknesses identified up in that discussion summary that we've talked about. Start with the most significant criticism and the most commonly noted criticism, and then kind of move down in priority to the least serious weaknesses that they identified. Another way that I've seen some people do it is to organize it by review criterion, significance, innovation, approach, for example. People do it like this. It's not my favorite way to do things. I think if you really have a strong case for doing it like this, because of however your criticisms were sort of targeted by your reviewers, I think it's an acceptable approach. One approach that I don't love is organizing the concerns by reviewer, so having a section for reviewer 1 and a section for reviewer 2 and a section for reviewer 3. I think it's more effective if you organize it sort of more scientifically by the major versus minor criticisms, as opposed to just calling it out by reviewers. But again, the best way to do this will really kind of depend on your individual reviews. So you need to kind of take this advice and adapt it to whatever you think works best for your specific set of concerns that you're addressing. Okay, so a few words about being responsive. So again, avoid the temptation to treat this as a rebuttal. You need to adjust your tone and just be really responsive and say, hey, I heard you. I agree. These are great suggestions. You're really helping us improve the grant. Just take that kind of tone in your resubmission. Resist the urge to be defensive, even a little bit, or argumentative. As you get more senior in your career and better known to these study sections, you can get away with a little more kind of rebutting things, but especially as more junior investigators, while you're still establishing yourselves in the field, you really just need to listen to the reviewers. And if they're wrong, and you know that, there are ways to deal with that. There are wordings that you can use, and we'll go through some examples in a few minutes, but there are ways to address things without coming across as combative and defensive and just risking really annoying the reviewers. So it's also really important to not only address the concerns, but tell the reviewers how you address them. So don't just respond to some criticism in the introduction without making a corresponding change in the proposal. So anything that appears on your one-pager, there should be a section in the grant that's actually changed in response to that, or in keeping with that, and tell the reviewers where that change is. Make sure you address any weaknesses that your reviewers have identified by significantly changing the proposal. So don't just do a little tweak here, do a little tweak there. Really take their words to heart and make a big revision to your proposal for whatever change you're making. So it shouldn't be a situation like if you were underlining your changes, it shouldn't be a situation where you have 2% of the text underlined. You should make more significant revisions on that, or more significant revisions than that. Even if you don't agree with them, you should attempt to solve the problem as they saw it, and then tell them what you did to fix this problem. So whatever they identified in your grant, fix it, find a workaround, eliminate it, change it, do something to fix what they viewed as a problem. And don't just argue about the criticism without changing the proposal. Importantly, if the reviewers misunderstood something, and this happens a lot, even if the information they're looking for is right there, just rework that section of the proposal a bit and explain in your introduction that you've now clarified this aspect. This is a word I like to use a lot when they just missed something. You say, hey, we've clarified this now, and here's where it is. And then they go find it and they say, okay, it's there, it's fine. We hope. And also, not necessarily in the one-page introduction, but in the revised proposal, respond to every single criticism that they've picked up on, even if it seems very minor to you. Just fix it. It is to your advantage to fix it. All right, does anybody have any questions before we go through some examples? And Carly, do we have an hour and a half, or are we ending at 9:30?
We are going until 10.
Okay, great. So I have just a few examples here. So these are examples that I actually pulled from the NIH website of some grants that were funded. And I'm going to point out some things that I liked and didn't like in these various examples. And hopefully, don't worry about all the details and the science here. That's not important. I just want to show you some of the language that people have used. So green is code for good, or code for I like it. So this person in their first paragraph, they say, thanks for the constructive critique, which has led us to add extensive new preliminary data and development of new reagents and animal models, which have improved the proposal, etc. So that's great. They showed what the big things were that they added, and they highlighted it right up front. And that gives the reviewers sort of a positive opening and also a roadmap as to what's going to come next. I also like how they organize their first set of bullets. So productivity and key preliminary data. This is just simple, gets right to the point, tells you exactly what you're getting. They didn't reiterate the reviewer's comment about productivity for 3 lines and waste a bunch of space. So that's nice. Here's another example where they've organized it kind of categorically. I think this must have been this is a K. So they talk about the review comments in the career development plan, and then they move to comments from the research plan. So normally this isn't my favorite way to organize things, but if you read this, if you want to read it closely later, I think it actually works pretty well in this case. I also wanted to point out here how they referred reviewers to the exact section or table or figure or whatever it is in the proposal to find these changes. So that's nice. And I like that they put it in bold. What I didn't like on this page was here, the italicized text. It's 3 lines of reiterating word for word what came out of the summary statement. So I find that to be a waste of space. I don't think it was necessary to reiterate the concern to this extent. They could have summarized it better and saved a little space for themselves, because the real estate on this one page is really critical. Okay, here's an example. I don't see this as much anymore, but it used to be kind of a trend, I guess, where people would add a chart showing all their scores in their summary statement. And to me, this is not a good use of space. They already know this information, and I don't think it adds anything. I mean, what's the point of this table to show what the scores were, which they already know? To me, it just is not necessary, and is a little distracting, actually. And then also they organize this by reviewer, which is not my favorite way. I don't think it's very effective. Here's another example that I think is argumentative, actually. So the criticism in blue was that the impact of this application on the institution is not clear. So some reviewers said that, okay. they open their response saying, this critique runs counter to compliments made by reviewer 2. So someone else, reviewer 1, maybe pointed this, had this concern, and they're opening it with a rebuttal saying, oh, well, reviewer 2 disagreed with you, so you must be wrong. And I think that's just a really ineffective way to counter this. So I have taken the liberty of creating a better response, which I would suggest if I was reviewing this for somebody, instead of saying that in blue here, instead of saying the impact of this application on the institution is not clear, change it around to say there is disagreement among the reviewers about impact on the institution. Okay, so that's a fact. That's not criticizing anyone or sounding surly or testy at all. It's just a fact that reviewers disagreed about the impact. And then the response here in green, you can say, we've now better explained and clarified the impact on the institution. Okay, and then you can keep the rest of the text the same. But with this response, you say, yeah, somebody didn't like this, even though somebody else thought it was fine. The person who didn't like it, we've addressed this. We've now better explained it for you and clarified it for you so you can understand. Okay, so I think that's a much stronger way. It basically says the same thing, but it's in a much more positive and less argumentative tone. Okay, some more examples. These are all kind of extracted, anonymized, but extracted from examples of actually seeing, and they are all kind of just really annoying criticisms. But I think common types of criticisms that some of you may end up seeing in your grants. So here's the reviewer comment. The grant is too focused on this pathway X, but what about pathways Y and Z? Why aren't you studying them, or why don't they matter? Or are you ignoring them? So here's one way you could go back in that I would argue is argumentative. We don't think pathways Y and Z are important because, and then blah, blah, blah. So I would argue that a better approach is we've now revised the proposal to clarify and better explain the importance of pathway X in the disease, and see the revised significance section for further detail. So you're telling them that you've changed the proposal to address the concern, and you're not rebutting them. You're not saying pathways Y and Z are not important. Maybe in your revised text, you can explain why you're focusing on pathway X without saying that pathways Y and Z are not important. Okay, so it's just about the tone. All right, another example. Pathway X is not well justified as a target for the study. So here's kind of a response. Pathway X is important because of XYZ, and you give the references and you say this is why we care. So I think that's kind of a weak response, and a better way to strengthen that would be something like this. So we have clarified and better justified the rationale for studying pathway X, which is important because of the following observations cited in references 1, 2, and 3, etc. And then you give a line or two explaining that. And then you say, see the revised significance section for more detail. Okay. All right, here's one. Experiment A won't work. You should do experiment B instead, because that'll work. A is just no good. But if you know that experiment B won't work and can't be done, and you think the reviewers are wrong, however, they think A won't work. So I think the best response in this case would be, we agree that experiment A may be problematic, and we've replaced it with experiment C. So you give your alternative that you know will work, and then you explain why. So you avoid doing experiment B that they recommended, but you've still solved the problem because you've taken out that experiment A that they don't like, and you've replaced it with something that you know will be successful, and you tell them why. Okay, so you don't have to rebut this, just fix the problem appropriately and explain why. Okay, this is one that just came up the other day, and it was really irritating, so I decided to stick it in here. So the person in their A0, in their first submission said, we will use mouse model B because mouse model A is not appropriate for whatever reason, and they explained it. So I think in this situation, mouse model A was kind of a standard model in the field or something, but they couldn't use it because of some reason. And so they said, okay, we're going to use mouse model B, and they explained why. The reviewer comment came back saying, oh, mouse model A is inappropriate for X reason. Okay, so what happened here? The reviewer misread the proposal, right? They just misunderstood. They misread the sentence. So a bad response, though, would be, hey, reviewer, you misread what we wrote and you're wrong. We didn't say, we said we weren't going to use mouse model A. So I think a more responsive way to say this in this situation would be, we've now clarified. So again, you're clarifying, just clarify. They're not wrong, you just clarify. We've clarified the resubmission to know that we are using mouse model B for precisely the reasons cited by the reviewer. Okay, that's all it takes. Okay, here's another one. The reviewer comment is that you need more data to support AIM2 to show the blah, 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 whatever you're complaining. And so I've seen people come back and say, okay, we did more Western blots to address this, et cetera. So I think that's kind of a weak way to address something like this. A better response would be to say, in response to this concern, so you're saying in response, we've done something, we've taken action, we've added new preliminary data showing that whatever it shows, and then you refer them to the figure. Okay, so use language to show what has changed. Don't just rebut it. Say, we've now added this and that. We've now shown that whatever it is, see new figure 5. We now discuss in this proposal. So make it really clear what's new and what you've done, just using language like this throughout. Okay. So the most common mistakes that I see in resubmissions are, does anybody have any questions before we go on, by the way? The most common mistakes, the number one, I said this earlier, is just really the overall failure to revise the proposal enough to fully address all their concerns. They just think you haven't gone far enough to change things. Resubmitting before you're finished with whatever additional preliminary data. I know there are pressures to resubmit and obviously pressures to get your grant funding as soon as you can, but I promise you, if you go in without the data that they wanted, you're going to set yourself back. So really just if you need to wait a cycle to get that extra data that you need, that's in your best interest. Another common reason for failure is just the introduction itself was non-responsive. So the language, the tone just didn't sound like you're going all the way to fix the problems. And then finally, if the tone is negative or defensive or cranky or antagonistic in any way, it's really just a turn off and it just annoys them. And that's obviously something you don't want to do. So in summary, my best advice to you is to make really significant revisions to your text of the proposal to reflect all the review comments. Be concise, stay really positive, don't be apologetic, but just address the concerns. Use that one-page introduction to make it clear what you've changed, to tell them where the changes are, and to set a really positive and responsive tone. And finally, don't argue with them because it won't get you anywhere. So with that, I want to direct you to the NIAID website. Has a lot of good examples. I think the NCI, National Cancer Institute, also has some good examples too. But AID seems to be the institute that has the most examples. So even if this is not your field, I think you'll benefit from taking a few minutes to go explore these sample applications. And they also have some summary statements and one-page responses up here. So you can really learn a lot that way. Okay, so with that, I'll take any questions, and anybody who wants to have a conversation about specific things that they have had come up like this in their summary statements, I'd love to hear about it.